Hello, everybody. Peter Maravelis here on behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers and our friends at PM Press. I'd like to welcome you to Dangerous Visions and New Worlds, radical science fiction from 1950 through 1985. This event is being made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, AKA the San Francisco Bay Area. Dangerous Visions is a weekend-long symposium exploring a time when science fiction became an ideal vehicle for an upsurge in radical protest. With the rise in the 1950s and 60s of liberatory and resistance movements focused on the inequalities of class, race, gender, and sexuality, a new wave of authors arose whose work shattered the writing conventions of the day. Their work skirted the tried and true tropes of genre and instead incorporated contemporary themes such as ecology, feminism, sexual liberation, McLuhan-esque media culture, corporate control, the rise of the surveillance state, the Vietnam War, and the rising currents of counterculture, which included everything from psychedelics to Black power. What we hope to offer you in the next couple of days is a kind of a sampler of work to whet your appetite and offer new perspectives on key novels and authors, as well as an exploration of topics, works, and writers who have been largely forgotten or undeservedly ignored. So our weekend event celebrates the publication of a new book by PM Press, which shares the title of our symposium. It's edited by Andrew Nette and Iain McIntyre. It contains over 20 chapters written by contemporary authors and critics and hundreds of full-color cover images, including 13 thematically organized cover sections. So it is well worth the price of admission just for the reproductions of those covers alone, which are really beautiful eye candy. So we'll be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboards with which you may purchase copies of the book. So to get our weekend started, I'd like to welcome now the editors of the book and the co-organizers of this symposium. Andrew Nette is a writer based in Melbourne, Australia. He is the co-editor of Girl Gangs, Biker Boys, and Real Cool Cats, Pulp Fiction and Youth Culture. Also the book Sticking It to the Man, Revolution and Counterculture in Pulp and Popular Fiction, as well as the author of a monograph on Norman Jewison's 1975 dystopian science fiction film, Rollerball. How many of you remember Rollerball? So he's contributed reviews and nonfiction to the Los Angeles Review of Books, Sight and Sound, Australian Book Review, the British Film Institute, as well as other journals. He has written 2 novels, Ghost Money and Gunshine State, and his short fiction has appeared in numerous print and online publications. So he is joined by Iain McIntyre. Iain is also a Melbourne-based author, as well as a musician and community radio broadcaster who has written a variety of books on activism, history, and music. His previous publications include also Sticking It to the Man, Revolution and Counterculture in Pulp and Popular Fiction, On the Fly, Hobo Literature and Songs, Girl Gangs, Biker Boys, and Real Cool Cats, Tomorrow is Today, Australia in the Psychedelic Era, as well as numerous other titles. So gentlemen, welcome.
Thank you.
So I would like to begin first by congratulating you on this wonderful compendium, and maybe see if I can have you talk a little bit about how you arrived at this project. I mean, you both have a track record in producing works that address counterculture. I mean, as I mentioned, and mentioning some of your works. So I'm curious to know, and what was the journey like for this one? I mean, how would you trace the trajectory?
Yeah, okay. Well, welcome everyone. It's amazing at 6 in the morning, my time, to have all these faces staring out at me at my computer. Thank you very much. I just want to acknowledge that both Iain and I are Zooming today from Aboriginal lands, from Melbourne, from specifically the territory of the Wurundjeri people. And I want to acknowledge that their sovereignty over this territory hasn't been ceded. Yeah, look, to answer your question, so this is, as you say, this is the 3rd book we've done for PM Press, which is broadly on the subject of popular pulp and popular print culture during the period which has been called by many people the long 60s. which sort of started in the 50s and basically went until the 70s. And so that's a period where I suppose most obviously marked by an upsurge in a whole lot, by widespread social change and an upsurge in a whole range of revolutionary, left-wing political and liberatory movements, everything from the anti-war movement, which is very relevant in the current situation, to black liberation, feminism, lesbian and gay liberation, the civil rights movement, etc., etc. So the first, and you've mentioned the two books that we've done before. The first, yes, I should say, sorry, just getting my drummers about me at 6 a.m. So politically, that was the long 60s. It also coincides with a period where, which has been called sort of the paperback revolution, which started in America in the sort of late 40s, or overlaps with this period of the paperback revolution, where the paperback sort of replaced the pulp magazine, I suppose, as a dominant form of sort of, I'd say lowbrow exactly, but popular pulp fiction. And there was a huge mushrooming of paperback publishers. They were after material. Some of that material verged on art. Some of it was just trash. It was, and they needed writers to write it. And in the process of doing that, obviously you had your fair share of hacks, but it also proved an entry point for a whole lot of much more diverse people, female authors, albeit much later in the process, black authors, of course, left-wing authors, etc. There were people, as I say, who were writing about, just basically writing their novels from a bar stool or a stool in a cafe, but there were also people who were writing about, about the experience that they had in particular countercultural and social movements. The first book that we did, Girl Gangs, Biker Boys and Real Cool Cats, looked at this from the perspective of how post-war pulp and popular fiction, mainly pulp, depicted youth subcultures after World War II. So we started off with how they, based with the sort of juvenile delinquent craze in fiction in the it started off arguably in 1947. I think that was 1947 with Erwin Schulman's The Amboy Jukes, and continued throughout the 1950s. That had different guises in different places. We covered the UK, Australia, and Britain. In the UK, that group of people were more known as teddy boys. In Australia, they were called bodgies, or the women members of that subculture were called widgies. Then we moved to beatniks, then hippies, and the sort of that counterculture, musicians, bikers, etc. Looking at how, following a similar format to Dangerous Visions and New Worlds. Book 2, a monster of a book, Sticking It to the Man, looked at how pulp and popular fiction tackled issues of revolution, the counterculture, the anti-Vietnam War movement, black liberation, etc., and also looked at, I suppose, for want of a better term, the sort of Nixonian sort of backlash against that has started to occur in the late 1960s and 1970s, when you had things like sort of, your men's adventure, vigilante novels, etc., that sort of stuff, which were sort of very consciously, in a literary sense, pushing back against various trends that were in pulp and popular fiction at the time. Originally, that second book included science fiction. I mean, it was a natural fit that we would include radical science fiction in that book. It just got too big and too unwieldy, and essentially PM Press has said, look, this is the book is just too big. So we just thought, it just occurred to us, well, there's naturally a third book out of this, which is the one we're talking about today, Dangerous Visions and New Worlds. And hence it was born. We basically had some material already, and sticking it to the man. We took that, we added a whole lot of additional material. It sort of flowed quite easily in some respects, this third book. And thus it was born.
Yeah. So could you talk a little bit about the philosophy behind this particular book? I mean, how did you decide on the subjects and the way that they interconnect with the larger vision for the book? And if you could also articulate that larger vision for us.
Yeah, well, I guess it's looking at radical science fiction, and I suppose, how do we define what's radical in this case? Well, I suppose it's works that push the boundaries of the genre and fiction overall. And I think with this third book that we've done, and with looking at science fiction, speculative fiction, that kind of high-low culture, hardback, paperback, literary pulp distinction was particularly blurred in the sci-fi field compared to, say, some of the other books that we had looked at. The radicalism, I guess, for some authors, as well as illustrators and designers, was mainly seen in terms of expression, style, aesthetics. You had the influence of the Beats, modernism, new journalism, William Burroughs, psychedelics, non-Christian spirituality, all these things kind of pushing people to create something that was experimental and quite different to before. But at the same time, many authors were either part of or were influenced by left-wing, anti-authoritarian and liberation movements. And so that shifted the topics they wrote about and the way they approach stories set in the past, present and future. So sort of from the kind of radicals in science fiction had, or radical ideas challenging, I suppose, the status quo, whether it was literary or political, had certainly, been around since, the late 19th century. And there had been some writers, certainly in the kind of golden age of so-called science fiction, from the sort of 30s to the 50s, had been, kind of exploring political issues, challenging and destabilizing the kind of conservative literary, sexual, political and other conventions that had become associated with science fiction. But really it's in the mid to late 60s that they kind of break through, so that these kind of thought-provoking and experimental and politicized works, which emerged at that time, kind of gained enough momentum to be dubbed their own sort of, subgenre or genre, the new wave of science fiction. And there was some resistance from fans, publishers and editors, but these novels and stories and this turn in general became hugely popular, to the point where it's pretty much dominating awards in the field in the 1970s. So that's the kind of radical science fiction that we wanted to capture in this book. There was some, we couldn't fit absolutely everybody. It was extremely, not only a sort of longish period, but also an extremely fertile one. So we sort of started off by thinking about, I guess, just who were some key writers and books that we felt had to be in there. We wanted the book to be kind of a mixture of, I guess, celebrating those key people, but also bringing back into light people who had become largely forgotten, but also bringing back into light certain books. So yeah, and also by the time we did this third book, we had as editors, we had a group of writers who worked on our previous books. So we asked them for their ideas around who should be in there, but just as importantly, what new angles could we offer on some people who are reasonably familiar. We also were able to, as with our other books, bring some new writers involved. And so that's kind of what we ended up covering. There are the better known people in there, but hopefully something new about them. And, a bunch of people who are kind of lesser known, but we've brought back to light. And as with our other books, we really wanted to show the huge range of covers, and that's what we've done as well.
If I could add too, Peter.
Yes.
I think just to pick up on one point that Ian makes that I think is important in all three of the books. Yeah, the books are a mixture of the people that I suppose you would expect to see in a book on this subject, but also a whole lot of other people. So it's important, it's vital to include Samuel Delany, Octavia Butler, Michael Moorcock, etc., those people. But it's, in this case, it was important to us to sort of, I suppose, to expand the notion of what the science fiction new wave was. To expand that into how the sort of how the new wave looked at gay and queer sort of themes, to look at how it looked at YA, young adult fiction, to look at, as Ian says, authors who basically haven't been associated before for various reasons due to their with their activity with the new wave, whether that be Joseph Dennis's The Black Commandos or William Bloom's Quay series. I mean, it's important to have that mix, I think, and that's both, as I say, I think it's an historical thing in terms of expanding our notion of what the new wave was, but it's also something that we personally enjoy doing, sort of bringing to life those, or putting some light on those authors who've been sort of more or less completely forgotten.
Yeah, and I think also, following on, particularly from Sticking It to the Man, where we kind of looked at how radical politics sort of impacted on genres as sort of, mainstream genres, but as hugely afield as the kind of men's adventure, vigilante type books, and to see, how were some leftists able to do stuff within that field, but also how did the kind of your more right-wing pulp hacks kind of deal with the upheavals of the 60s and 70s. So we also have a little bit of crossover there in this book in terms of how was radical science fiction and radical politics kind of touching on those kind of macho kind of fiction as well.
Right on. Well, once again, I really would like to congratulate the two of you on this awesome book. I'd also like to thank you for all your efforts in making this event come together so beautifully. I mean, there's so many moving parts here, so that's really appreciated. So as we move along with our program, I want to remind everyone, it's really difficult to represent all of the wonderful subjects contained in the book. So please do pick up a copy. We've posted it in the chat in a link. We're also going to be posting it throughout. For a full roster of this weekend sessions, please visit the City Lights website at citylights.com to learn more. I want to take a moment to thank Stephen at PM Press for all of his efforts in making this weekend happen. His work has been invaluable. Also to Ramsey Kanan at PM for acquiring the book and for all the incredible books that PM produces. So this event is made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our late founder, Lawrence Ferlinghetti, by fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture. Their public events, publishing programs, and educational outreach are dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So our first session of Dangerous Visions is coming up. It's titled Imagining New Worlds, What Activists Can Learn from Sci-Fi, or actually what can and have learned from sci-fi. It features Iain McIntyre as moderator, and he's going to be joined by Annalee Newitz and Shelley Strebe. So very glad you could all join us for this incredible weekend. See you shortly.